Hey everybody, I'm Albert, and I'll be your moderator for this next panel. So for starters, I think we all can agree that it is an exciting time in Ethereum. And for me personally, one of the biggest reasons I enjoy being a part of this ecosystem is the really special, extraordinary people I've had a chance to work with and learn from. And two of the best examples of this are up here on the stage with me today. Barry, Brian. Every time I talk with you two, I learn a ton, and it's usually fun, too. So I'm excited for us to have another conversation here today. So the topic of this conversation is what to know about zk. And that's a pretty big topic. But I think we can make some headway. For me, when I try to improve my understanding of something, I try to look at it from a variety of vantage points. And when it comes to zk, I think there might not be anyone in the entire world with better vantage points than the two of you, especially when we talk about zk in the context of Ethereum's future. One reason you two have such special vantage points is not only do you do technical and product work, but you also operate as coordinators, you provide guidance, technical assistance to a lot of other people and projects in the ecosystem. So on that note, can you share with the audience a bit more about just what you do on a day-to-day basis? I'll start with you, Brian.
Cool. Thanks so much for the introduction, Albert. And thanks again to EDCON for having us here. So I gave a really brief introduction during the talk on programmable cryptography. But just to reiterate and give a quick intro here, I'm Brian. I'm the executive director of 0xPark, which is a relatively new research organization focused on application-level R&D on Ethereum and other decentralized platforms. We're particularly interested in applied zk, and it's one of it's currently our most major area of focus because we're really excited about the potential for zk and related primitives to really unlock the next generation of Ethereum applications. As far as myself, a lot of my day-to-day is spent thinking about how to empower various grantee teams in our ecosystem with new project ideas, with new educational materials, coordinating between different teams to put them together and figure out, like, maybe Team A has a gap where Team B has knowledge of and vice versa, and they should be talking with each other, and trying to holistically understand, like, what are the needs at the different levels of the stack, from infrastructure all the way up to application, to understand, like, where might we need to put more either grant funding or educational resources or whatever else to ensure that the whole space is kind of moving in tandem.
Cool. Barry?
Hey, I'm Barry. Thank you, Albert, for that nice introduction. So today, so I work with the privacy and scaling team at the Ethereum Foundation, and we have like two major focuses. Our first focus is on privacy, and our second is on scaling. So today we'll talk mostly about the privacy stuff, or the like applied zkP stuff, I suppose. That privacy is maybe not the best description of, because we do some scaling stuff with zkPs, and we do other like proof of validity stuff with zkPs. So that's our main focus, and like I'm excited to talk today more about like how we can apply zkPs to different things in the ecosystem.
Awesome. Thanks so much for that. And one thing I want to share with the audience is one of the things I really love about both of your groups, privacy and scaling at the EF, PSE, as you guys call yourselves, and 0xPark, Brian, your group, is what I've seen is that your groups are both very alike and very different. And you kind of have this combination of being alike and different in the right ways so that the whole becomes greater than the sum of the parts, which is something that I think has really happened with PSE and with 0xPark. I think one of the core things that makes you guys similar is you both have a desire to solve the actual problems that exist as opposed to like settling for superficial or defensible solutions. And I've seen both of you and your respective groups demonstrate a deep sense of responsibility for how you go about doing things and like a willingness to prioritize kind of the collective good here. And so I just want to say that the broader zk ecosystem is really lucky to have both of your groups. And on that note, let's like dive in on the core topics here. So one of the challenging things with zk is it's like so damn interesting, you almost don't know where to start. And one way that I like to start in those situations is to ask people what has surprised them. Like, you guys are two experts in many ways. So what has been surprising to you over, let's say, the last 3 years? You know, it's been 3 years since the last EDCON. It's been 3 years since a DevCon. That's a long time, especially in this space. So yeah, what has been surprising to you? And Barry, maybe I'll start with you.
Yeah, sure. So like, there's a bunch of things that have come up over the last couple of years that have been surprising. The first major thing that I was like wrong about before was I thought that like the zkEVM was going to be impossible to do on like any kind of practical level. And I think that that was because there was some, like, one really nice thing about doing the zkEVM project is it kind of forced us to explore the limitations. And when we did that, we found like a bunch of optimizations that we're now able to apply to other primitives. So that was surprising and also really nice to find. The other major thing that I think was surprising is just the depth of things that zkPs can be applied to. That, like, when I started, I thought it was mostly about private applications. But it turns out that, like, as we explore more, we learn about like all the different places where you need zkPs in order to enforce like computational correctness as opposed to privacy. One example is zkEVM, but there's a whole bunch of other examples of where you need that.
Yeah, I'll jump off of that actually and echo some of the sentiment from Barry's comments around zkEVM. I think one of the most surprising things about the applied zk space to me has been, in general, first of all, how accessible it is for especially math and programming generalists. And you know, we've found time and time again that applied zk seems like a really scary sounding topic. And I think a lot of the reason for that is because it encapsulates a lot of things. It encapsulates things from applications to infrastructure to theory. But when you focus in on one of those layers, especially one of these layers that hasn't been as fleshed out, for example, the application stack, you'll find that there's just so much low-hanging fruit that actually someone, you know, with, say, like an undergraduate math background can quickly, you know, ramp up into and become really effective at. And I think that, you know, as a consequence of that, the other thing that's been very surprising to me is just how fast things have been moving. I remember, like, you know, 3 years ago, if you were trying to build like a browser-based zk app versus today, if you're building a browser-based zk app, first of all, the developer tooling is just phenomenally better. But second of all, even on kind of like naive metrics around holding the same like level of, let's say, like difficulty in working the stack constant, how much better are our provers today than 3 years ago? It's something like a 3 orders of magnitude difference. And we see examples still across like the entire proving stack of where we can continue to push on these tools to be more efficient. And even on things like, you know, sometimes we'll start building a primitive that seems useful or important without quite understanding like where it might be useful. So for example, like implementing different cryptographic primitives inside of zk circuits, we'll do that without even some sense of like, oh, you know, like what is a specific application? Maybe we have got like one like toy application in mind that only kind of makes sense. But once you build out the primitive, and you take that to the people who are thinking at the application level, suddenly there's like, you know, 6, 10, a dozen different things that people are like, oh, actually that unlocks this totally different thing. And you couldn't have predicted that in advance, but it just happens so quickly, even in a matter of weeks.
Yeah, I think I have to say that it has been remarkable to me to see how fast certain things have moved. And this is even from the perspective of being fortunate to have been around zk for several years. And I'm sure that's exciting for everyone to hear as well, because, you know, we're all looking to build better stuff over time. And I think a natural like kind of follow-up question here is just, well, then how do you see like zk complementing the future of Ethereum? So I'll actually chime in here with some, like, start with the obvious, which is, you know, zk technology, it fundamentally enables better scalability and better correctness. And, you know, both scalability and correctness are very important for blockchains and, of course, Ethereum specifically. And one thing I've noticed is I don't think those are the first things that jump to mind for people when they hear zero knowledge. And that's a bit of a shame, because if you look at where zk technology is being applied, a huge amount of it, I would say the vast majority, is towards things like improving blockchain scalability and improving the correctness of systems, whether it's blockchains or otherwise. You know, the zkEVM stuff that you mentioned and we saw a presentation about earlier with Hai Chen is a great example of that. So, we have that kind of as like a baseline for how zk complements the future of Ethereum, but I feel like you guys have an even better kind of lens on that. So, Brian, maybe I'll start with you on that.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think a lot of the most important ideas here are the ideas around transparency and building something that doesn't, that people can align on, but doesn't have to be completely transparent, as I was alluding to in the earlier afternoon talk. But this idea that, in order to have something that we come to consensus on, like the thing that we're coming to consensus on must be known by everyone is really, really limiting. And in fact, I would say that it's only a small subset of applications that we've seen so far built on blockchain that we've only seen a small fraction of the possible applications for blockchain as a result of just this fundamental limitation that I think zk and these new kinds of cryptography are going to enable.
Yeah, very much so. I really like the idea of scaling consensus in a way that's not just layer 1 consensus, but it's community consensus around things. The major thing that comes up for me when I think about this is scaling, but also it's this idea of we have so much, all of the data on Ethereum is public, and that makes this very rich data set that we can use to make proofs about different things about us. That Brian gave a really good example earlier about the Ender chest in Minecraft, where you have all of these attestations and you're able to just kind of compose them in a way that you want. And in order to be able to compose attestations, we need to have ZKPs. And that's one of the really cool ways that the two complement each other.
Yeah, definitely. Another framing that I have on this is this idea that ZK snarks enable you to make proofs that are stateless in some sense. So, you can prove that some secret corresponding to, some password corresponding to a deposit note that is in a specific Merkle root. But, what Merkle roots do people care about making those proofs on, right? It's an interesting thing. A lot of times, when we run educational programs and take people through the idea of a cryptographic mixer, one common confusion is kind of well, in the ZKP, can I prove that the note that I'm withdrawing is in the EVM or is contained in the EVM state root? And the answer is no, you can't. You can prove that you have some password that's contained in some state root, but what is actually the machinery to make it such that we've got a source of state roots that everyone agrees are the important ones? And I mean, that's almost the definition or purpose of a blockchain. The point of a blockchain is to come to consensus on data that we all think is significant or important or unambiguous. ZKPs are stateless. You need to combine them with something that is stateful for those proofs to actually have meaning to people.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that's a really beautiful way to kind of think about how these two technologies are just very naturally complementary in ways that we're really still just scratching the surface with. And, of course, that process is going to continue. So kind of continuing with the sort of theme here of what to know about ZK and my approach of taking different vantage points, one other way I like to look for vantage points is to play what I call the overrated, underrated game, right? So what's underrated about something or what's overrated? So let's start with what's underrated, or just something that you think is underrated about ZK today. Barry, I'll throw it to you.
Sure. So one thing that I think is underrated is that when you're using, Brian already talked about how groups are really important and how we have this massive data set. And one thing that I think is overrated is that ZKPs will make people become more collectivist in their thinking, because when you're trying to participate as part of a group, you need to think about the signal to noise ratio of that group, that you want to be communicating from groups with high signal to noise ratio. And in order to do that, people will start to kind of carefully curate the groups that they participate in. And they'll even start to think about the ways that they communicate affecting the public perception of those groups.
That's really interesting. Actually, I'd love to dig in on that a little bit more if you don't mind. So when you talk about groups and sort of, quote, being more collectivist in thinking, can you kind of unpack how ZK works with these groups and like why it would lead to that sort of approach?
Sure, sure. So like basically the way that it works is that like when you're part of you're part of this group, and every member of the group is able to make signals is able to make zkPs proving they're part of the group. And each time they make a proof, they can attach some kind of like message or communication to that. So it becomes this fun kind of social media application where you're able to make zkPs and you're able to prove you're part of the group. Then the next logical step is to think that like, okay, well, which are going to be the important groups in this new world? And like with some more thinking, it seems clear that like the important groups will be the ones that have the highest signal to noise ratio, that have the least amount of like spam and just nonsense messages, and the highest level of like just insightful and thoughtful posts and discussions. Like, and like, because every member of the group wants to be in the groups with this highest signal to noise ratio, they want to be in the most prestigious group, then every member of the group will start to try and make the group that prestigious and that like high signal to noise. But there's also this fun duality where like, while the nature of groups being shared make them become more collectivist, there's also this like strong individualist trend that's applied from the privacy. Because when you're making posts, you're private, so you're talking from the group, but like the actions that you take can't be like attributed to you personally. So it's this really fun duality there.
Well, that's super interesting. It's something I really haven't thought about much until now. So I'm glad we're having this conversation here, and it's something I'm definitely going to be, thinking a lot more about moving forward. Brian, what jumps to mind for you from the underrated standpoint?
Yeah, well, maybe the first thing is just to add on to Barry's point, because I think it's such a great point. Like, we have a handful of community members in particular who are thinking about like applications of ZK for digital identity, including like Lakshman, Ayush, Sampriti, and Vivek, who have been building apps like HeyAnon, which allows you to prove that you're a member of a group and then anonymously like tweet with a cryptographic proof that that's being attested to by someone in that group. And one of the interesting dynamics that I think like these folks have been thinking a lot about is that there's almost a like common pool of group credibility that you have to take responsibility for. And when you're speaking on behalf of the group, you're really either tapping into that pool of credibility and then altering it. So I think that point about the collectivism there is really interesting, and it's not something that people are thinking that much about quite yet. I also think it is something that we do have some history of understanding on, like even with the internet itself enabling people to be anonymous and to build these like digital communities that aren't tied to your real world identities. There's like a rich literature as well to draw on. Maybe the other thing that I'll mention as something that I think is underrated is, this isn't even something specifically about the technology itself, but more around like the social environment surrounding it. While ZK and applied ZK has so many applications to blockchains and cryptocurrencies, unlike blockchains and cryptocurrencies, one interesting thing about ZK is it's not really possible to make a bunch of money in a short amount of time. And while that seems like kind of a silly thing to bring up, it has some really like real impacts on who ends up coming into the space. I mean, for anyone who's ever like, sent a tweet that has like the word MetaMask in it, you just see all the bots and scammers and stuff falling out. I think that the ZK space right now is really high signal to noise, and that's something that I really value and want to preserve. As a result of, it's something that you can't quite get into just to build the equivalent of like a scam coin.
I'm glad you brought that up because, yeah, one of the things about blockchains, and I would say it's truly one of the best and worst things about them, is that they're inherently financialized, right? Like the innovation of a blockchain is really the introduction of incentives to like more classical, traditional consensus theory, and incentive is sort of like a scientific sounding way of like saying money or things of that sort. And I found that in the ZK space, it is really one of the best, if not the best places to focus on these like very interesting problems, but problems that are also still grounded in like pragmatism, which is something that the blockchain world also forces you to do. And I think that combination is very hard to find anywhere else, even in the rest of the blockchain ecosystem at times. So yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up. Maybe now going in the other direction, anything you'd call it as overrated, perhaps?
Yeah, so I think that when we talk about things that are overrated, we need to think about it from different perspectives. That I think that in the Western world, financial privacy is something that's I think pretty overrated, because there's a lot of people focused on that, and it becomes this like big discussion in the ecosystem. And I think that like there's just a lot of other like super interesting things that we can do that should have like similar kind of like discourse around them. For example, I think that like the ways that Western societies work is that like money is one tool, but there are a whole bunch of other tools that decide how our societies work, what people think about, and those tools are like, well, how can people speak? How do people get heard? Who gets heard? How do we decide what to do? And like all of those things I think can benefit a lot from zk. So that's from the Western world point of view, I think that that's something that's a bit overrated. But I think that like in the global south, that doesn't really carry over, because I think that like financial privacy is just such a huge, important primitive to a bunch of people who are living in like just in a whole different world, where like the most important thing in the society is not really about discourse and like how we sort of organize together, and it's more about just like trying to just deal with a bunch more pragmatic, practical matters.
That's really interesting. I love the like kind of the nuanced differentiation of not just the topic, but like where it applies in the world. I think it's one of the things about blockchains in general as well that make them so interesting and challenging, right? Is that it is a technology that can do very different things for different people in different places. And one of the things that I know that we all spend a lot of time thinking about is, you know, how do the different things we do affect not just the people that we kind of are most familiar with on a personal level, but people in other places and other situations. And so really glad you brought that up, something I'd love to unpack with you more in a future conversation as well. Brian, how about you? Anything jump to mind as, quote, overrated?
Yeah, there's a few things. So I would say that, like, maybe the way I would frame this is like, I think that this is very important, like the thing that I'm about to say is very important, but that it is oftentimes seen as important or drawing attention at the expense of other things that are also really interesting. And that's the sense in which I mean to say that this is overrated. I think scalability currently like drives a lot of the like attention and funding into the space. And again, just to reiterate, like I think scalability is incredibly important, and like it has driven so much of like the research and innovation. However, I think that the privacy or information asymmetry aspect has been undervalued in comparison because of something that I honestly think of more as maybe even potentially just like a artifact of history or business considerations around, historically when ZK Tech was very immature, when you did have to in-house build your own proving system and infrastructure from the ground up, the only business use cases that would really justify that were building out these like entire monolithic systems, whether that's a roll-up or another like alt zkL1 or things like that. Those are the only things that can justify that level of investment to like building a cryptography team that implements everything end to end. And as a result of that, that's driven more, that's pulled in more of the attention at the expense of, for example, resources allocated towards these more like modular systems or like interoperable systems that enable smaller teams of developers to build out privacy applications.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, I'll never complain about improved scalability and efforts to improve scalability because, like you said, that's obviously very important. But I think this also kind of ties back to something we were talking about earlier, which is a lot has changed over the last few years. And the ability to work in this more modular fashion is one of the like really consequential byproducts of everything that's improved. And so it is, I think, worth drawing attention to the fact that that can be done a lot more today than a couple of years ago. And as a result, like, in comparison, that might make some of the things that really dominate a lot of the discourse, frankly, around like ZK, it might make them a bit overrated as a result. So really glad you brought that up. maybe now let's.
Maybe one thing I'll also say is, like, to be clear, I also don't think that the solution is to focus less attention on scalability and more towards privacy. Like, for example, the work that Scroll is doing is absolutely incredible, and in working with PSE on the zkEVM, but rather, building more of a narrative around the importance of these like privacy applications or information asymmetry applications, and getting more people to think in that direction, but not at the expense necessarily of one or the other.
Absolutely. I mean, at some level, attention is finite, and I think that's part of the challenge and the fun of being in these spaces that are so interesting and touch on so many different things. Is we have to constantly calibrate and recalibrate on really every part of the ecosystem that we're in. So I think it's an excellent point. Now I'd like to, I guess, zoom out a little bit. I'm not sure where this is going to lead, but I think it's always fun to ask people for predictions. So I hope I'm not putting you on the spot too much here, but I'd love to hear a prediction or two that you have for the ZK space. It could be something for the next few years, could be something for the next few decades. Brian, maybe I'll start with you on that.
Yeah, this one's interesting. Maybe I'll give like a few ideas that I think might be like we might be more likely to see in the near to medium term, and then a couple of thoughts on the longer term. Well, I'll start with the longer term. So one thing that I think we are starting to uncover is this idea that ZK applications might not be a coherent product category. Like in the same way that we don't call websites like HTTPS or like encryption applications because HTTPS and encryption are so ubiquitous, or in the same way that we don't call, I think, another example of this misnomer like 20 years ago is this idea of like .com businesses. Nowadays we talk about things like, e-commerce businesses, or like a landing page for XYZ, or a SaaS business with a web front end. We don't call these things like .coms or .orgs because the idea of a .com, or the idea of using encryption to secure traffic that's going back and forth across the internet, is just like, that is water, that's table stakes. And I think as we move towards this world where we're having a lot more of these like decentralized applications, where we have these needs for privacy, information asymmetry, or like stronger types of encryption, those things are just going to become like table stakes for the infrastructure that applications are built on top of. So that's maybe a first prediction, is that like ZK apps, like ZK is not going to feel like a specific technology for a specific category of apps. It's going to underlie, the next generation of decentralized applications we see built on the internet. As far as like shorter or medium term predictions that might be more actionable, I'm personally really excited about a lot of the work that's happening in, and I'll say specifically, instead of ZK identity, I'll say ZK enabled digital identity systems, kind of pushing along that narrative of the long term prediction, as well as ZK enabled ML primitives. I think that there has been a surprising amount of progress in the last year in doing things like, putting machine learning models inside of snarks and figuring out like where are the appropriate applications for running those, as well as, like Barry mentioned, both the like creation and discovery of groups and the mechanisms to be able to prove claims about membership in groups. Both of those things, I think, will probably see something that resembles like, at least some use case that ordinary people find useful in the next couple of years.
Cool, I love that.
Barry, what comes to mind for you?
Yeah, so when I think about this, I think about like just on a longer scale, time scale, I'm thinking about like 2040 kind of timelines. I think that at that time, someone will have won a Nobel Peace Prize for something that involves EKPs. So let me give you an example of a potential future here. So imagine that like this kind of like so during like international peace negotiations, building trust is a really important part of the process. And part of that process involves like showing how many troops you have or how many nuclear weapons you have. And like in the future, I imagine that like a lot of these components will be to do with like software bugs. Right? I have a 0 day in this product. And like so like one potential future could be that like as part of these negotiations, we both make zero-knowledge proofs to prove how many 0 days we have, and then we just reveal each of those issues and manage to patch like some really important piece of software.
That's incredible. I'm so glad I asked this question now because I was definitely not expecting a prediction like that. So we will check back in 2040. Not going to hold you to it, but I do love though what's more important than the specific prediction, right, is the underlying thinking here, and it's absolutely true. Like you said, trust and building trust and the process towards building trust is fundamental to relationships at every level. So whenever you have technology that can play a role in that, which blockchains themselves also do, it's undoubtedly going to have an impact at some time scale on like how those things work in the future. And I love how you made it kind of concrete with a specific prediction like that, because I think that really helps hammer home this point. Otherwise, it's easy to be like, yeah, trust and negotiation and so on. But no, that's great. Well, so in the remaining time, I guess here, just want to hit on a couple things real quick. Maybe love to hear a little bit more about how you got involved in whether it's like Ethereum or zk, because I think for a lot of people, it's like always hard to sort of imagine how they can get into the space. And what I always tell people is, honestly, people kind of just find their way here a bit. And maybe your stories can help like sort of shed more light on how that might happen. Brian, I'll start with you.
Yeah, so I guess I mean, one of the funny things about coming back to EDCON here is that EDCON is actually the first like crypto event that I ever attended. This was back like 4 years ago in 2018, and Albert was the one who pulled me into that EDCON. So it's just fun to be back here and chatting on stage about zk like as the space has grown like immensely. But I think that the story of how I got involved with zk stuff was a series of seemingly improbable coincidences, I would say, that like really highlighted a couple of interesting things that, well, I guess I'll explain. So basically, in 2019, I happened to go to a conference on zero knowledge, like on a whim. I found out about it on like a Friday. I think Albert told me about it. And then on the Saturday was when the conference was starting, so I like flew over. And then at this conference, I like learned that like, okay, zk Snarks now had like multiple different tool stacks for actually like building end-to-end applications with. Anyway, so this was really cool to me, just like on a purely intellectual level. I was like, oh, nice. Like that is, I don't know, like the progress in the cryptography here is just like interesting. So I went home and I happened to then walk into a bookstore 2 days later where the 3-Body trilogy was on display. And I picked up the 3-Body trilogy, and I think I was supposed to be like doing something else that day, but I like started reading it, and I just like ended up reading the whole book. And then I came back the next day and I read The Dark Forest cover to cover. And I came back the next day and I read Death's End cover to cover. So this is a sci-fi trilogy by Liu Cixin that's centered around this thought experiment called The Dark Forest, which is this idea of like, the game theoretic dynamics between different spacefaring alien civilizations. So I got to thinking about this and I was like, oh, like, I like just went to this zk conference. I also just read about this like Dark Forest, like, premise for these like sci-fi books. And I guess actually like one thing you could do with zk cryptography is you could make like a zero knowledge crypto Dark Forest. And then from then, we sort of realized that like, oh, zk is like possible to do on this thing called Ethereum that I was also like had been thinking about for the past year. And also the tool stack just happened to be barely good enough to make the proofs work in browser. And so it's just like all of these interesting coincidences, which really highlighted to me, it was almost like, everything in this space is so interdependent on everything else. And it was almost like, we were like getting like a bump in a set, and we just had to hit the spike in terms of building this Dark Forest game that ended up spinning up a lot of other interesting experiments.
Cool, thanks for that. I think we got maybe a minute left here, so Barry would just love to hear you take us home here.
Sure. Okay, so I got involved. Right. So my journey into crypto was like a little bit bumpy. So and like I didn't really know. I didn't really know what was happening, but here's some things that happened along the way. In 2015, I deleted my Facebook account. I started to become concerned about like the power that people had to like manipulate me and like our discourse into doing different things. So I deleted my Facebook in 2015, and like I didn't realize it at the time, but after that I felt this like loss, you know? I lost a community that I had been building for years. And like, I still think about that today. I mean, I still don't know which of the people I went to school with have kids now or not. And like, anyway, that was the first thing that happened. And like about 6 months after that, I got really interested in Ethereum, and I wanted to build like a purchasing cooperative for T-shirts. And like the idea was people would pool together their money, and they would get a bulk discount on like some T-shirts. And like I didn't realize it at the time, but like both of these things kind of connected into my like search for community. That I lost my community on Facebook because I felt like it was being weaponized against me, and I kind of went out to search for this other community. And like the ZK stuff and the scaling stuff was all just like, oh, my search for community, we need to do X, Y, and Z.
It's really interesting. I actually didn't know that story, so I'm, again, really glad I asked. So Brian, Barry, to the EDCON organizers, thanks so much for joining me up here today. Hope everyone enjoyed.
Thanks, Albert.
Thank you, Albert.